All right, so I am joined by Dylan. Dylan, thanks so much for coming on to talk about capitalism. This was
My
originally
sincerest pleasure.
this was originally going to be a debate, and hopefully it still will be. But I mean, we've debated and discussed all sorts of things in the past, and they usually wind up being more free-form discussions, which is super fun for people who might be watching this. You might think at first that I'm like a right-wing guy and Dylan is kind of a left-wing guy. There's like some truth to that in time orientation, but if Dylan's left wing, he's a left wing guy that's really into guns, and I'm a right wing guy that thinks abortion makes sense in many cases. So like, it's a little bit more all over the place than that. But so I
Well,
was, go ahead.
I love how you frame that right at the top because so many of the terms when you try to discuss something like capitalism, we tribalize almost immediately, and then we end up
Right.
debating things where we actually agree. We just don't like the label that we've adopted.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think interestingly, capitalism is one of those words that tribalizes, which is one of my criticisms of it. So I had put out a blog post, and as these things go, there's an initial form of an argument, an initial idea seed that's not fully mature, and I've been working on this idea of a critique of not a critique of capitalism, but a critique of the word capitalism, the utility of the word for some years now. I put a blog post. I'll probably attach a link to that blog post, though my view has advanced a little bit further. But basically, I discovered that the word capitalism was actually coined by a French socialist, not Karl Marx, in 1844. Although the word capitalist and capital are much, much older. A capitalist is older than capitalism, which is kind of funny when you think about it. Um, but it was used to describe a system, and what that system is might be a big part of this discussion slash debate, which will probably be more like a discussion. But I began to realize that some of the formulations of capitalism as a system are either tautological or nonsensical. Not all of them, but some of them. And then I realized that a capitalism is a system where capital is owned by the capitalists. It's like, well, if a capitalist is someone who owns capital, then the capital is owned by the people who own the capital. It's like you're not get this is Geico. You can save up to 15% or more. This line graph covers everything. Um, there are of course better definitions than that, but um, in its original conception, it seemed to argue against a system of less restrictive government policy. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized, well, that's like not having policy restricting commerce. The more you do of that, the less of a system it is. It's actually not a system. It's attacking a non-system as a system. Um, and the characteristics of such an economy would actually not reflect capitalism as described, but would reflect the cultural values and the geography and other factors of that society, not reflect the system of less regulation. The characteristic quality of a system would arise from the rules that govern it, and those rules could be values external to economic policy. Now, that is also not the only definition of capitalism. The best definition of capitalism I've heard, and this is actually criticized from the right as well as from the left, is a criticism of our system of finance, basically, as it is protected by the government. But that seems to be a very different idea than the sort of unregulated free markets that are advanced by, for example, like the Austrian school. And so what we end up with is a conversation usually between Marxists on one hand and anarcho-capitalists on the other, are yelling at each other with two very different concepts of an economic system with completely different ideas of what that word which describes both actually means. And that's sort of where my view of like capitalism as a description of a non-system as a system that would only apply to the Austrian school, or at least the sort of the Bailey that they retreat to when the Mott is attacked. Um, but when I hear the left-wing critiques of what they're calling capitalism, I mean, I'm not as economically trained as you, but there seems to be some real validity to at least some of the points, which gets lost when the attack on capitalism is referred to as an attack is immediately interpreted as an attack on free markets and a justification of sort of command economy or something like that.
Well, I think the place you got to start right away is one of the phrases you said was capitalism as described, and my question would be described by who?
Right.
You already referenced the Austrian school of economic thought, which I am a card-carrying member hater of that particular school, mostly because I like math and reality. But you really, if you want to have a debate about capitalism, the first thing you have to do is get on the same page as to whose capitalism we're going to debate,
Right.
because there's basically, there's several different versions of what we're talking about, and people have conflated this. So what you're talking about with the criticism of the financialization of everything, that's an extension of neoliberal capitalism as it comes out of the Chicago School of Economics with Milton Friedman. So that's a relatively new invention that Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and Ricardo and Keynes and to a certain extent Hayek would also be looking at and going, that's just feudalism with another name. And so when people are talking about, late stage capitalism, they're talking about late stage financialism is probably a better way to put it,
Okay.
because that's what we're actually looking at.
So I have a question here. When I think of free markets and capitalism, my mind usually jumps to von Mises, because everything I have a bit of a libertarian spirit. I like the idea of libertarianism, even though I don't agree with it. I had a debate with a libertarian Australian politician last year, which was super fun. Um, but like the problem with libertarianism and capitalism in the Austrian school, in my view, is von Mises' praxeology. And praxeology attempts to build a worldview of human action and justifications for human action on this tautology of all like voluntary exchanges are rational by definition. And that's actually not true. Uh, which is like the baseline of my critique, which I'm borrowing from Matthew Crawford. But for when I talk about libertarianism, because there are libertarian socialists, there are anarcho-capitalists. There are all different there are minarchists. There's all different brands of libertarianism that get there by different ways. Some of them get there by a sort of a moral argument. I think Murray Rothbard was in that camp. Some of them get there by an economic argument, like Milton, your favorite guy, Milton Friedman. Um, some of them get there by this sort of philosophical axiomatic baseline, but like von Mises. And those are very different arguments. And so what you're just and so I would, rather than attacking libertarianism, which could refer to all of these and none of these and whatever else, because I would describe myself as libertarian-ish in some ways, but I would attack praxeology. And so what you're describing as neoliberal capitalism, is there a particular idea at the root of there? Because my understanding of neoliberalism is that like unrestricted free trade doesn't seem to be the foundation. Um, but I could be
Well,
wrong about that.
okay, so this is kind of impossible to talk about without a really brief history lesson. And
I'm
it's
here for
interesting.
it.
It's interesting to know, like, okay, let's just start with the OG Adam Smith. If you had gone to Adam Smith in 1776, kind of an important year, but that was the year that he published the the Wealth of Nations. And if you had gone to him and be like, "Wow, this is a great economic book," he would have gone, "What's economics?" He was a moral philosopher, and so, but philosophers in
As
and
an
of themselves.
aside, one of the interesting things that many people don't know about Adam Smith is that his his treatise on human sentiments is like one of the most criminally underrated books in moral philosophy. Moral philosophers treat him very seriously, without even talking about his Wealth of Nations. Everyone knows his Wealth of Nations. No one knows his treatise on sentiments. But anyways,
Right.
continue.
Well, and I've read both, so you don't have to. The Wealth of Nations is a massive book, and it's very hard to get through. It's notable that you hear all about this invisible hand, but it's only used once in that gigantic book. So what he was doing was he was looking at what was evolving with mercantilism as an economic system failing, and watching the various winners of mercantilism, for lack of a better term, trying to cling to that system.
Can you
And so
give us
that's
a
what he described.
brief explanation of mercantilism?
Yeah, mercantilism, and this is going to relate back into with Milton Friedman. Mercantilism was basically, you can think of the economics of colonialism. We take over, we're Britain, we take over India where cotton grows. We make it illegal for them to spin their own yarn, so we're shipping cotton back to England. We turn it into yarn, and then we bring it back to India to sell that fabric in order to extract gold.
So would
So
you say it's a almost fascist style command economy, but with an international focus rather than a national focus?
So it'd be hard to say that it's fascist because industrialism isn't part of that
Okay,
particular economy.
gotcha.
I would, if we're going to really split hairs on fascism, it requires,
I,
private
I
ownership
shouldn't
of
have
industrial capacity.
I shouldn't have said fascism because fascism has some very, very particular nuanced meanings and connotations about history and the spirit of the nation versus the people and so forth. But
Yeah.
I'm
I
thinking
mean,
just associations as far as a command economy.
yeah. So mercantilism at its core is who has the gold, right? And so the point is to find a place with resources you can exploit in order to bring more gold to you.
Hmm.
And this is happening like in Spain. They're mining Central and South America for as much gold and silver as they possibly can, thus creating an inflationary effect, but they didn't know why. They it had not occurred to them. And so that became the mercantilist arms race. This is why we had such a huge expansion in colonialism. But as we saw in 1776, some of the colonies were getting a bit uppity and not particularly caring to be extracted from anymore. And it was becoming more and more expensive to maintain that system. And so what happens in England is they ban slavery, and then they start to industrialize as a way to backfill. That was one of the forces and trends and forces to backfill into the economy. How do I make up for the fact that I can't just beat these people into working in my mill? Oh, I'll hook it up to a water wheel and let the water do the work. So
Yeah,
that's the
banning
environment.
slavery doesn't seem like a very good mercantilist move. Um,
No, it wasn't, but it's notable that the of the mercantilist nations, the first one to do so industrialized the fastest.
yes. Well, and I've heard many people argue that the North winning the Civil War, being a byproduct of the North's superior industrial capacity, was largely based on the fact that the North had moved past slavery much earlier than the South, even though it still had slaves at the time. But it was its economy was not based around slavery in the same way, and the absence of the slavery created a need, and that need led to greater productive quality. And you could reach backwards and look at, well, like, well, maybe Sparta was so backwards for so long and didn't develop because, I mean, aside from ideological attachments to tradition in the past and not wanting to evolve, it was also dependent on a helot slave class, um,
Correct.
that, like, you're not going to advance if you've got this free labor to work with.
Yeah, and Adam Smith was aware of this. Like he's looking at the same thing that we're discussing right now, and basically kind of calling out what's the difference here. And in the same case of using the American South during the Civil War, they're clinging to an economic system and not adapting steam engines and stuff that would have made it better because of inertia, essentially. And what Adam Smith is looking at and saying, one of the things that he's really against is monopolistic control. He believes this is the whole invisible hand of the market. If I try to compete in this market, I'm going to inherently innovate. Therefore, the butcher's going to want to be the best butcher. The bread maker is going to want to be the best bread maker. And then eventually we all, the cheesemaker wants to be the best cheesemaker, and we end up with a superior sandwich. And that's his ideas. But he wasn't blind to the negative externalities of that system.
Right. So, like, because I can already hear things that would make a Chicago school economist like giddy with delight about
Mhm.
competition and so forth. And of course, as you're aware, um, the word meritocracy, when it was first introduced to the English language, was a pejorative. It was the idea that we're all going to be competing with each other and like fathers will abandon their sons because this other kid works harder or whatever. It's a there are some perverse incentives when we build everything around economics, and I think very interesting that you pointed out that even as he was essentially founding what we would call economics now, Adam Smith was still speaking more as a moral philosopher.
Correct. And operating on an economic concept called the labor theory of economics. And that's going to be important here in a second.
Could you explain the labor of theory of economics? Because this is very, very important, but it's something I think many people have heard but don't fully understand. And it's
Okay,
very easy
so
to straw man.
it is very easy to straw man, and like there's lots of problems with the labor theory of economics, but essentially in a nutshell, it's the idea that you have inputs to production. You have capital and you have labor. The way you can think about it is machines and people to run them are the two distinctions. So I, as the capitalist, would maybe have the machines, but I'm only one dude. I can't run an entire steel mill. And so I have to buy labor on the market in order for that to come in. Now, the Adam Smith, and this is not me, this is Adam Smith, he says in The Wealth of Nations that labor is the primordial input of everything. That capital is nothing more than the excess labor of the laborer. And therefore, the majority of the rewards of capitalism, of the economic system, he didn't use the term capitalism, but of this economic system,
Hmm.
should go to labor because if you remove the capital, we could still probably get it done. But if you remove the labor, nothing's going to happen. And so the labor theory of economics is essentially looking at this from an input output standpoint. Who's bringing more to the table? Who's actually generating the money? And where is the rewards of that production going?
And I could see someone with a mathematical background saying, well, this has to be true, basically axiomatically. Now, of course, we know this is false because we've seen AI data centers and the promise of infinite AI robotics without labor. So obviously, uh, I'll
Well,
save my jokes for later.
we'll
I'll
see if
save my
we
jokes for
cross it.
later.
Yeah, that is so far out of scope. I have exceedingly strong opinions on AI data
Yeah.
centers, but
Um,
outside the realm of this discussion.
Yeah, just the idea of like a hand drawing itself like an MC Escher painting, um,
Correct.
is like the promise that there's or the infinite motion machine. Anyways, um, uh,
So
but
this
but
environment is like getting to praxeology
mhm.
from 1776 with the Wealth of Nations up till 1848. Everybody was on the labor theory of economics.
Okay.
Everybody was just remixing Adam Smith. And 1848 is important for three reasons. Number one, that's when John Stuart Mill published the last, what we call classical economic treatise. Number two, that was when the revolutions of 1848 occurred, which was a workers' uprising. And that happened all across Eastern Europe. And that's the year in which the Communist Manifesto was produced.
Mm,
And so what you have now is we have a good amount of data and experiential data in how this system's working as we're industrializing across the European continent. We have a gigantic workers' rebellion in Hungary and Austria that then bled into what we call Poland now and Germany. And you now have people like John Stuart Mill, who lived down the street from Karl Marx in London,
mm,
calling for the government to step in and deal with the negative externalities of industrial production. And the Austrian School of Economics, and Mies specifically, comes out of that environment as a response. That's why we call it the Austrian School, because the Austrian Empire went, that's not really how we want things, and I don't want to be challenged again. Let's develop a whole new thought. So praxeology rises, and one of the foundational bedrock ideas of praxeology is data is useless. You can't use data. You have to think about it axiomatically.
right.
And that's where we made the switch from the labor theory of economics to the allocation of resources economics, also
Well,
known as scarcity.
scarcity is its own thing. My understanding of the strong critique of the labor theory of value is not like, and this is maybe even a separate issue from like how you compensate workers, but how do you measure value?
Hmm.
You can look at it from a sort of input perspective. Well, but what's the value of this labor? And the usual critique is that, well, ultimately the value is not determined by the laborer, and like this is what my labor is worth. Although you can say if you're only going to pay me X much, then I'm not going to work in your factory. But it's determined by the customer and the culture in general, which says, $8 for a loaf of bread is too much. I'm willing to pay five. And it's what people are willing to exchange that ultimately, like, is where we find the true value of a thing. Now, there are Platonic questions that we could ask there. Is like, is consensus really the best gauge of value? We can say, actually, uh, if we say something is undervalued or overvalued, we are articulating an idea that there is a gap between what the consensus is and what the real value is. Now, how we get to that real value is its own interesting philosophical question, and it leads to all kinds of other things. But the question of how we determine value, I do feel like the Austrians or the Chicago school, for whatever else they get wrong, might have a point as far as the problem with the labor theory of value, as far as how we get to this idea of value. Now they make their own wrong turn with their assumptions of this is really what value is. It's like, is it? I'm not so sure.
Well, you can, I mean, it depends. Yeah, I'm going to get Keynesian here for a second and ask, what does the math say? Right? So if I look at, I'll use an example. I'll put on my Marx hat here for a second and quote Das Kapital. Let's talk about a pair of shoes, right?
Hmm.
So we work in a factory, and you and I, we're making shoes. And really, to cover all of our expenses, our living expenses, we know we can sell these shoes, call it $10 a pair. And
People are
we
willing
only
to buy
have
that.
to, what's that?
People are willing to buy that.
Correct. Correct. We know we can sell at this price. And we then know that if we produce 10 pairs of shoes in one day, we've covered ourselves for the whole week.
Nice.
And so then we say, well, hold on a second. I did that. That was what we did on Monday. We've covered our expenses for the week with what we've produced, but we're going to keep working the whole week. And now we've produced four extra sets of weekly income. And what Marx is looking at and saying is says the value of all inputs is whatever the revenue of that operation is. So the question is, what is the allocation between capital, the people who are owning the machines, and labor, the people who are running the machines? The labor theory of economics, under Adam Smith, and by his own admission in The Wealth of Nations, is labor should be walking away with the vast majority of that because without their inputs, that doesn't function. They don't need the machines to make shoes. They could do it without it. But the machines don't function without the labor. Under the
Yeah.
Austrian school, they're now looking and trying to intellectualize this into price signals. And so, therefore, labor stops being an input and starts being a good that you purchase on a market. So,
Well,
we've dehumanized the labor side.
I mean, from a mathematical perspective, we would have to dehumanize the labor if we're looking at it mathematically. I think the humanity part is separate. I was at work a couple weeks ago. We were drilling holes through brick wall for 2.5 inch rigid conduit. It was really not fun. And it took me about 45 minutes per hole, standing at the top of the ladder with this freaking, huge core drilling bit. And 45 minutes is not a short time for drilling, but it's a whole lot shorter than what it would have taken me to like chisel those out or something, you know. And from a business perspective, like they're keeping me on because that loyalty and the maintenance of a worker is, and I have other expertise that's valuable in other places with electrical stuff. So, you know, um, we're going to pay you, however much journeyman electrical wages to do this. But really anybody who's reasonably strong could get up on that ladder and drill those holes, and maybe for a lot cheaper. The the question of who is doing more work, the laborer or the capital, the drill in this case, is it seems premature to begin uh off the bat with an idea of well, the laborer is doing more of the work or the drill is doing more of the work. Maybe you do need a drill like that, but only 10 people in the world know how to operate that drill. And so, yeah, you need that drill is super valuable. It wasn't in my case, but there are instances of capital like this. Things where like maybe in making chips, for example, you're an
Well,
NVIDIA person and you
if
need
you go back, if you go back to that, I'm going to just stop you for 1 second so
sure.
we don't lose it. If you go back to the very thing, you have a drill. So
Hmm.
someone owns that drill. I'm assuming not you, but let's just
Yes.
for the sake say I own the drill.
Hmm.
Okay. And the value, I'm going to collect, say, $100 for drilling that hole. And then I pay you 20 bucks an hour to drill the hole. And I take the other 80 bucks an hour, the other 80 bucks, merely because I own a drill. All I have done is monopolize a means of production. This is where the
Well,
means of
you
production
you
comes
you
in.
bought that drill to
I
start
did buy
with,
it.
which
I
is
did buy
important.
it.
Yeah.
And because of my ownership, I am saying I should be, without having to do anything else, I should collect most of this. Adam Smith's idea,
Yeah.
the labor theory of value, would say that drill's great and it's going to get more productivity, and that's wonderful, and we should have that. However, the drill is not going to drive. The drill ain't going up the ladder by itself. It
Yeah.
requires you, and
It does.
you being the person on the ladder taking the risk of doing the drill should be compensated more highly than me in my air-conditioned office doing nothing, just merely owning something.
So that
And
then there's a practical counter to that. Was if the person who spends this drill happened to be let's say $2,000. Um, the company uses their company business card, goes into debt to buy this thing because it's needed, and the job itself is not paying a $2,000. So they go into debt to get this tool that's necessary to do the job.
Mhm.
If the company is not compensated for the like proportionately for the capital investments that are necessary to the job. I mean, there are questions like, well, maybe you're getting into a business where you're just not going to make much money, so you should get into a different kind of business, that's one outcome. But like if the company goes into debt to get this drill that's necessary to make these holes, and they are not being compensated for buying the capital necessary to make the work happen, such that the debt can't even be taken care of. I'm not saying that's the case with all these companies, because it's many of these companies are making extraordinary amounts of money. Um,
Which
but
is the counterpoint to what you're creating here, but
right,
continue.
right, but also many companies go bankrupt. And so both can be true. There's a fairly wide bell curve, I think, as far as there are some companies that do extraordinarily well, and then there
Well,
are
the
thousands and thousands
argument
of companies that just go out of business.
the argument that the Austrian school and Milton Friedman more specifically would argue is that in your scenario, this company goes into debt to buy a $2,000 drill where the first job is not going to pay for it,
Mhm.
and they want to extract wealth and cash, not only to service the debt but also to make profit.
Right.
And they would say that because they're taking that risk, that you, the worker, take no risk, and so they take the risk, and therefore they should have the lion's share of the reward.
Hmm.
I personally, I would very much disagree with that because I don't think that's how that works. And secondly, that is the function of capital, is to go get that drill so that we can do more and we can all make more money.
So when you
But
say
when you
capital,
when
are you talking about the drill, or are you talking about financial resources that one might use to buy such a drill, or are you talking about both?
they're
Or
both.
okay.
A drill is just cash in a different form. So like, I run an accounting firm. That's what I do for a living. I'm the owner.
Mm.
So I have employees, I got payroll, I got benefits. I go buy laptops. And so I buy that laptop, I buy the software for that laptop, I buy the cybersecurity services to make sure that all data is secure on those laptops. And then I pay for a office, and I pay for desks, and I pay for monitors and stuff like that. Now, I'm providing these inputs. That capital should entitle, my risk, my financial risk on that should be rewarded, right? The question isn't whether or not I should be rewarded. The question is, should I be taking 90% of the production of these people when if they don't show up to work, I'm screwed.
So it's kind of a moral argument, but it's also, to go back to Adam Smith's position, it's a kind of sustainability based on inputs question.
Correct. Adam Smith, and I'm going to extrapolate. So this is Dylan's opinion of Adam Smith, not Adam Smith speaking on himself, and I want to make that very clear. Is if you asked Adam Smith, should the workers be allowed to organize themselves such that they can help control the cost and price point of their labor, he probably would have said yes.
Well, I mean,
And
wouldn't that be a function of a free market? Like, what would prevent that?
well, that again, maybe that's a little bit outside because what we're talking about is a union.
Yeah,
Um,
I'm aware. Yeah, but
okay,
I
I'm
guess
just making it explicit.
the and this is a criticism that goes against like democracy too, is if a free market can organize into and has a tendency to organize itself into structures and hierarchy that undo the very freedom that it was that was originally conceptualized. In what sense is it still a free market?
Well,
And we can talk about this
this is
as
a
like
good
the
point.
paradox of tolerance. And I'm just like, well, then like, don't we just reject tolerance as a value? Don't we just reject free markets as a value if the tendency is to organize into hierarchies of value that, for example, might place humanity over just number go up or whatever? Um,
Well, but so the number go at economics that you're talking about is coming out of the Chicago school, not coming out of classical economics,
right. The
right?
Chicago school
So
people would say, but when number go up, people's welfare go up. And it's like, well, that's an axiomatic assumption. Uh, let's look into that. Um,
well, the best way I've always described the Chicago school is there's 10 people sitting around a table that has a single orange on it.
mhm.
Everybody statistically has a tenth of an orange. Now, one guy finds a way to monopolize 9 oranges that he owns by himself, and then there's one more orange that original orange still in the middle of the table. And so now he's got 9 oranges, and everyone else is sharing the remaining orange. And statistically speaking, everyone has an
Right.
orange. So therefore, we've gotten better.
But see,
And
that's
then,
a problem with mathematics too.
well,
Um,
that's a entire that's where Keynes really really shines is in pointing that out,
mm,
because then Milton Friedman came back and took the criticism of of Keynes, which was that math isn't showing what you think it's showing.
yeah.
And then basically he said, well, there's no problem with that guy having 9 oranges because you now have a ninth of an orange where you had a tenth of an orange before. And what Adam Smith would say, if the other 9 people busted their ass to make those 9 oranges for that guy, they should be entitled to a greater share of the profits.
So now we're getting into really Rawlsian territory. Um,
Kind of, but
because
I do think
Rawls is very much a defender of inequality insofar as someone from behind the veil of ignorance would choose this society to live in as a just society. As a sort of I'm not a Rawls fan, by the way, but like there's some utility in thinking about it in application to these sorts of questions of equality, distribution, and so forth. But
sure. Well,
yeah,
I think something that we really should visit though is because we've used the term free market.
yes.
And the
What's
like
that?
again with the yeah, what is that? And my question when I started reading Wealth of Nations was free from what? Right? Free from what? And when you read
Or
Adam
free
Smith,
to what?
yeah, yeah.
Two times.
What you read from Adam Smith, if you go through and you soldier through the Wealth of Nations, the first thing you realize really quickly is he is not against government interference or regulation at all. He's actually extremely in favor of it.
Hmm.
So the question then becomes, okay, but if it's not free from government interference, which is what the Chicago School reinterpreted later, free from what? If you let Adam Smith speak on his own terms, it's free from rent seeking, of which he believed not monopolistic control was a form of rent seeking. So was land ownership. So was just holding on to equipment and forcing out other industries so that you were the only game in town and therefore everyone had to work in your mill. These are things that he looked at and said, the market cannot work because it's not competitive. Therefore, individual self-interest isn't guiding anything. So a free market is one free of rent seeking.
Now, my inner libertarian is coming out and saying, "But Dylan, the greatest rent seeker is the government. Think of taxation, and taxation is theft. And I like already as that thought is forming in my head, I'm imagining, I don't know, a socialist or a sort of progressive of some sort saying, well, yes, to some degree, but we don't have a choice as far as no rent seeking. There's no such thing as no order, and the order maintenance has to have some kind of financial sustainment of its own. And that
Well,
might
that's
feel like
where
rent seeking, but it's like the paradox of tolerance again.
well,
And a
that's where
lot of it's what you
Ricardo and
call it.
Mill really come in.
Okay.
Right? When you look at Ricardo and he's the guy with comparative advantage.
Yes.
I'm good at doing one thing, you're good at doing another thing, let's trade and we're all better off. That's Ricardo. Mill is looking at it and saying the social utility here is, we should have the free enterprise, but part of the negative externalities is orphans or children without arms. We should be and there's no profit
That's no
seeking,
big
there's no
deal.
market. Yeah. There's no market force that's going to cause a correction in that. Therefore, this is the role of the government to step in and to regulate these things. And in the case of natural monopolies, right, to make sure that they're either heavily regulated or state controlled. And
So
that
really,
these are not Marx ideas. These are classical economists' ideas.
so I really like that we've been talking about these issues without invoking the word capitalist, because the labor theory of value, the what you might call mathematicalization or statisticalization of labor, be they adults or children, um, praxeology, these kinds of things, I think, are the more underlying ideas. How do we think about the value of a human life? Is there even a price you can put on it? And the answer might be yes, and it's maybe $2 million or whatever it is, or it might not be. But those I think are the more important questions, and where government sits on that. I, I used to be much stronger against the government. I'm still semi-strong against the government, but there's clearly some necessity for some role to play, particularly with infrastructure, as you're talking about with the protection of uh, children at the very least, ideally the labor force in general. Um, the libertarian, I think, might say something like, well, the government traditionally doesn't actually care about its people in that way, except insofar as it sees its people like cattle, as property, as if not slaves, then serfs of a sort. And it's in that ownership of its own population that it has a vested interest in protecting them. And we can say, well, it would be better if they valued them intrinsically, if they valued their human life for like moral reasons. But the libertarian might say, well, that is pie in the sky wish thinking, and that doesn't extend beyond Dunbar's number, just psychologically.
Well, I mean, I'll put my cards on the table. I have a very strong libertarian streak, but I acknowledge that it's the same political philosophy as that is shared by a feral barn cat, right? Like it's completely convinced of its own independence, completely dependent on a system that it just doesn't want to acknowledge. The thing that I'll say in response to that is that one of my big critiques of libertarianism is they want to avoid the big T tyranny of the government and accept the big T tyranny of corporatism instead. And
Right.
when companies, I mean, United Fruit is a great example of this. The East India Company is another great
Johnson and
example of this.
Johnson,
What's that? Johnson and
Johnson and
Johnson
Johnson,
with Amazon.
Foxco.
Once they get to a certain level, they function as de facto governments.
Right.
And so to me, when with that knowledge, if you want to be a capitalist, and I consider myself a capitalist, I have capital, I deploy capital, I run a business, I make a payroll, I hire and I take care of my employees. But when you look at this and say, what is the essence of capitalism? It's the essence of competition. Do I have
Hmm.
competitive, do I have the ability to compete? In my
Okay.
industry, Everybody is everyone's a potential client for me because I do taxes. And I also offer a lot of other services. But when I'm up against somebody, if they and I tell my clients this, if you find somebody who's a better fit, go there, but at least tell me why you went so I can get better. So
Sure.
I'm trying to elevate the client experience, and that's how I'm competing in the market. This would
But
be juxtaposed against somebody who is, take private equity, for example, buying up all of my competition and consolidating them, thus making the market less competitive and offering fewer choices to the consumer.
so you would say that the people who would maybe defend capitalism in the Austrian or Chicago sense are in fact doing practices that lead to less competition.
I would argue that the Austrians are barely capitalist and the Chicago school is straight up not,
Okay.
is actually how
But
I would argue that.
but this is where we run into the terminological problems. First of all, I have a question I was thinking about like 20 minutes ago, and it's just coming back to me now. Um, would you consider employees to be capital?
No,
No. Okay.
no.
I was thinking about it before when we were talking about slavery. I'm like, if they were, would that be de facto
If
slavery? And
you,
it
you
could be
said
by
employee, not
degree.
slaves. If I own
Yes.
slaves, then yes, they are capital.
Right. Right.
But
Um,
I mean, I find slavery to be abhorrent. So no, I want I pay above market rates for my employees. What that leads for me is first off, I have a higher quality of employee, but I also have a much lower turnover than my peers, which means, and this is again part of my competitive advantage in the market. I'm not switching out people every year on my clients. It's the same person year after year after year. So
but
now we're creating a
Dylan, don't
relationship.
you know that is inefficient? You could outsource that for half the price
I
and get
could, I could, and my competition does,
yeah, which is why
right?
you get better. Or, anyways, the other question, as far as capitalism as competition, I like the simplicity of that a lot, and I would definitely get behind that notion of capitalism. My question is, I don't think that's what the French socialist who coined the word meant, and I don't think it's what most people are talking about when they talk about late stage capitalism, like just a system that emphasizes competition. Because we could hypothetically imagine that, holy shit, Karl Marx was right. The workers unite spontaneously and overthrow everything tomorrow. And now we're living in a Marxist communist society. And no one owns any capital individually. I mean, we would own it collectively. Um, but we still need to work, and there might be competition in an informal way. Um, for like who does the best stuff, who grows the best corn, like 4-H pig competitions are not incompatible in theory with I mean you wouldn't own the pig, but you might be its caretaker or something. Um, like that's not you could have competition within a Marxist society. In fact, I'm quite certain we would find some way to be competitive because competition is in our nature. Um, I I'm sure there was competition in fascist societies, at least for the competition for the you know preference of the state. Um, and there's competition in all sorts of ways, but those systems we don't generally refer to as capitalist. So I would almost just prefer the word competition and say competition is good, and capitalism has something to do with competition, but it refers to competition in a very particular sense and maybe not in others. For example, if we were a Tibetan monastic Buddhist society and we are literally competing for holiness and sanctity, we're competing, as Robert Sapolsky joked about with injecting Buddhist monks with testosterone. They become more competitive to be charitable, more competitive in their loving kindness and stuff. Like
Which is one
that's
of my favorite studies, by the way.
yeah, like it's he's like testosterone doesn't make you aggressive. It just makes you more competitive in what you already value. Um, but like that competition is not the capitalism in the economic sense that we're usually talking about. Although, if we're being sufficiently precise in our terminology, we could define it that way, but that's
Well,
not
but that
usually.
is the invisible hand. When people want to talk about the
Mm.
invisible hand of the market, the visible hand, at least the fingers on it, are competition. And
Okay,
so, is that an exhaustive definition of capitalism? No, but it's a critical element. It's a cornerstone of it.
sure.
The other cornerstone that I would say is you have price signals for the allocation of capital. This is the stock market and things like that. There are the propensity to be able to take on risk and allocate capital and kind of, for lack of a better term, fuck around and find out. I'm assuming I can swear on this.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
is
This is
part
not
of
for
this
kids,
capitalism.
anyways.
So you've got we're trying to limit rent seeking because to your point, you're never really going to get rid of it. I'd like to circle back to is the government a rent seeker or not?
Yes.
Because I think that's an interesting conversation. So we want to be free of rent seeking. We want to be free of of monopolistic control. We want to be have strong competition. We want to have a freedom of capital and resources, so a free flow of that. And those four elements, I would say, are the four corners of capitalism.
Okay. Free. Okay. Interesting. So one of the most interesting criticisms of Ricardo, I hear, and this is a bit of a tangent, but are you familiar with the writer Vox Day by any chance?
I mean, I've encountered that gentleman a number of times.
He's an odd one. He's
That's an
really
understatement.
he's he's really wrong on some things, but he's got some very interesting arguments. He did a criticism of Ricardo's theory of competitive advantage. Um,
Comparative.
Comparative, I'm sorry, yes, not competitive, comparative advantage. Um, on the basis of him not accounting for the movement of labor that came with it. And there was a very one of my favorite books of his actually is on the question of free trade, which was a debate book with a libertarian Chicago school economics professor. It was a really fun book, a sort of side point, I think, on the question of the free movement of capital and the connection between the movement of capital with the movement
Well,
of
and
labor.
that's an extremely salient point, right? That if you take Milton Friedman and the other neoliberal, well, they're called neoclassical or neoliberal
Mhm.
economists, then we should be celebrating open borders because that's the free flow of labor.
Well,
There,
this
we
is like everyone gets so mad at Donald Trump for his immigration policy. Before Trump, the biggest champion of closing the borders was Bernie Sanders. And Bernie Sanders was saying open borders was a Koch brothers conspiracy, and he was not entirely wrong about that.
Yep. I mean, it's a question, and so like when you go back to okay, so the essence, rent seeking, right, or competition, then the role of whatever regulatory body, in this case the government, would be to foster that. So when they would look at it and go, okay, is this anti-competitive behavior? And this is what we did in the United States from basically the 1930s up until Reagan.
Mhm.
Is we said, when people got too big, we were like, no, you're being anti-competitive. And yes, there was an acknowledgement of natural monopolies and things like that, but that's where they would break up companies to be able to continue to create. And what did that do? It issued in one of the most technologically growth orientated economies ever seen.
You know, it's so funny. I was just walking my Homer students through about a month and a half ago. I have a meeting with them later tonight. Maybe some of them will watch this. An essay by Nietzsche called Homer's Contest. And Nietzsche argues that what Homer did is he basically sublimated the competitive spirit of the Greeks from warfare into something that was civic rather than discivic. So instead of the blood feud, we have athletic competitions, funeral games, and stuff. But the problem, Nietzsche argued, is that if someone was too good, it would destroy the competition. And so there was there's always this risk of the best competitor being banished, being uh, sent away from the city. And it extends far outside this dynamic of competition, and you can't have someone who destroys the foundation of competition, or else the competition itself is
Well,
destroyed
this is
outside of
basically what
economics.
you described if we update Nietzsche for the modern era, you just described in shitification.
Mm.
Was essentially like Uber is the classic example of this, although I can pull out any that Facebook, Instagram, Microsoft in general. And essentially, we're going to do something that's highly anti-competitive. In the case of Uber, driving down the price of a ride in order to undercut taxi services. Those taxi services close, and then they work, so they've captured the audience. Now they got to get the supply of drivers, so they really subsidize those drivers. And then when they're the only game in town, they turn around and make it a terrible experience for all people, and they're just taking as much money as they possibly can.
Mm.
This is something that Milton Friedman would say, well, that's just how the market goes. This was their, they went out there, they took this risk. This is their just desserts. Basically, anybody, further back in time from say 1945 would look at that and go, no, that actually, like, they didn't compete fairly. They don't have any competition, and because they don't have any competition, they don't have any accountability, and because they don't have any accountability, they do heinous shit.
But the
And this is Gilded Age
but a free market in the sense of without some kind of regulatory intervention to stop certain I don't want to call it cheating because cheating implies breaking a rule, and in an unregulated system there are no rules. Um, but a sort of violation of the commons in this way, and it's not clear which part of the commons is being violated, maybe in different senses
I
and
would
different
argue that it's
contexts.
not even a violation of the commons, it's the enclosure movement, but in the technological space. They're sitting there and cornering this
Mm.
off and going, this is mine, and I can do whatever I want with this, even if
Well,
it hurts you.
I mean, the enclosure movement is just taking away the commons,
Correct. Which is
which was
exactly what Adam Smith
my
was looking
which was
at.
my brilliant 21-year-old idea. It was just borrowing from libertarians. It's like, oh, there shouldn't the tragedy of the commons is the reason we shouldn't have commons. And then there's a are you familiar with have you heard of a guy named Kurt Doolittle by any chance? This is kind of a
Possibly.
newer guy talking about he used to call it propertarianism. Now he talks about it in other terms like science of law. I'm not sure what he's calling it now, but it was from his school of thought and one of his disciples, I suppose, who I first presented me with data on the effectiveness of commons, and it's like, well, actually, commons work really, really well
Correct.
with certain caveats, with certain protections in place. And if you take away the rules, if you take away the protections, like, well, yeah, they can be taken advantage of. And then, oh, look, see, if you take away the protections, then it doesn't work. So I guess we can't have commons. It's like, well, what if we just have protections again?
Correct. Which it put it in another term is called regulation.
Right,
And so, but
right.
the results of the enclosure argument or the enclosure movement is what Adam Smith is writing in.
Hmm.
That's what he's looking at. And so his
Yeah.
critique of rent seeking is actually a critique of the enclosure movement.
Okay. So I'm thinking about this in electrical terms now because in electrical world, the regulation is the NEC, the National Electrical Code,
Hmm.
which doesn't come from electricians, doesn't come from engineers. It comes from the fire department because they don't like fires, uh, even though they, makes them busy. Um, and these regulations do drive up the cost of electricians and the cost of it makes us get paid more because we have a lot of rules that we have to follow. We have to get inspected and everything. And so libertarians will often point to the the cost of the regulation, which is real. Um, but there's a cost to not being regulated too. There's the sort of enshittification you described, there's the monopolistic control, or there's
The
just
Chicago
fires.
fire,
There's just fires, yeah.
the Chicago fire
And
is
other
is a
disasters.
great example of
There's
this.
oil tanker spills that kill millions of fish and all kinds of stuff like that. Um, so how you break that down is actually I don't think there's a system that we can point to and say, well, this is the philosophy to take. Everything seems to be something we have to dig into the details on a sort of ad hoc basis and say, does this make sense? And that's a lot of how electrical stuff happens. I am a, not only am I a fan of the NEC, I have become more of a fan of the NEC the longer I've been in the business and the more crazy DIY stuff I've seen. It's like this should not be allowed by home flippers who are buying a house, turning it around in less than 2 years, and then selling it to some unsuspecting person that they have no idea that there's like free air wire nutted connections in their walls and things like that.
Oh, trust
Um,
me, I bought one of those houses.
I'm so sorry.
Hey, I grew up in the trades,
Yeah.
man. First thing I
Yeah.
did was backpull the entire first floor.
Wow. Yeah, so it's like it makes sense in those contexts. However, it can go too far. And I think I invoked Matthew Crawford earlier, and Matthew Crawford was pointing out how, many of the things we've done in the automotive world with cars, um, safety measures we've put in with, airbags everywhere, these seat belts, and seat belts are nice because they're relatively cheap. It's a very, very cheap way to make cars a lot safer. But with all the crumple zones and the airbags and the backup cameras and the side cameras and all this other stuff, and making those legal requirements, you are actually pricing a lot of poor people out of being able to own a car, especially if you combine that with like a cash for clunkers program that is specifically designed to remove affordable cars in the language of safety, unsafe cars or polluting cars from the road. And so this is not to say that safety is a bad goal or not polluting. Like our roads just smell better. I was around in the 90s. Um, it was an
Same.
unpleasant place to be, you know? It's freaking stank to be around traffic, and it definitely stinks a lot less now. But there's a reasonability that has to be worked in, and no one likes to put mathematical, numerical, financial values on human lives. But this is kind of like what, and now I'm, meandering back into your domain or something closer to your domain. Like actuarial science is about this basically.
I was
How
going
do
to
we
say
price this?
there's an entire society of people who really enjoy this, putting a
Yeah,
price tag on this. Well,
yeah.
okay, so let's just talk about that for a second in terms of what give Milton Friedman his due, what he's looking at as a distortion from regulations, and
Hmm.
cars are a great example of it.
Yeah.
Why does Ford not make any cars anymore? Well, the answer is the CAFE standards. And so the cafe standards came in, and then the car manufacturers jumped on board with it because then they could have the small cars, and but they could make the trucks, and they didn't have the same regulations because the trucks the that cafe standards didn't apply to. And so this created this distortion effect where now buying a car is actually next to impossible. And we're in this arms race of getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And because we're getting bigger and bigger and bigger, we're now having things like front overs. We're for the first time ever seeing more pedestrian deaths due to cars because
Uh,
they're just too big and they're going too fast.
yeah.
And this could be alleviated. Like this is a good example of the cafe standards were a good thing. And from a national security standpoint, from an economic standpoint, it made a lot of sense. The problem is that they've been hijacked in order to be anti-competitive and to creating these gigantic machines that we don't need, which is why we're being priced out. You apply the cafe standards and say, okay, look, you want to have your pickup truck, that's fine, but that's a commercial vehicle. You need to have a commercial driver's license for that, and if you want it for if it wants to be a pavement princess, you're going to have to adhere to the cafe standards. You'll see that cars get a lot cheaper.
Yeah.
And
Well,
and
so there's a danger here too, because I think what we're coming to is an idea that regulations are both A, necessary. You can't have a society without regulations, and B, they all come with a cost. There's a
correct.
degree of corruption, and there's a degree of gamification, and a degree of all these other things. And so when you use regulation to answer the problems of original regulations without removing some along the way, and I'm not saying we should remove as many regulations as possible, but it seems like we lack a mechanism for the removal of regulations when they're no longer around. And my biggest complaint with cars, and this might be related to the KFA standards you were referring to before, I discovered last year that Toyota was bringing back their Hilux, and you could buy one for 10 grand, brand new, off the line, 0 miles, 10 grand. Fucking amazing. Not legal in the United States. I think that might be changing soon. I think that might be changing. I think there are some people in the Trump administration who are like, we should be able to have these. I don't
I
know.
I
Uh,
I
but
will be cautiously optimistic for that. But
yeah,
let's get real crazy on it and have a conversation about BYD. BYD
BYD.
is yeah, that's the Chinese car company.
I've not heard of
BYD
this.
is so BYD is getting ready to unseat Toyota as the most popular car manufacturer globally. And they're
Wow,
doing it without access to the American market.
that's crazy.
That's insanity,
Yeah.
right? So essentially what's happened, and we can argue all day as to how it happened, but BYD has created a superior product at a superior price point. And the response to our capitalistic loving, America is no, we'll just ban it because we want to protect Ford. That's not competition.
No, it's not.
That's not, to me, that's not capitalism. That's protectionism. That's
Right.
something else entirely.
Well, so
Because for me, to your point, I would
mhm.
love to replace my car. I drive a Nissan Sentra because I'm cheap and I'm an accountant. So, take that for what it's worth. But I continue to get people be like, "Would you like to buy a new Sentra?" And it's like, no, you want $27,000 for a flippin' Sentra? Are you out of your mind? But
Yeah.
that's the whole competition. If China can figure out how to do it better and they can do it cheaper in an actual capitalistic free trade economy, they should be here.
Well, but this is where the regulation question enters the international geopolitics domain. And like I don't want to weigh in on the whole like China versus America frickin' geopolitical fight and the variety of reasons we might have grudges with each other and so forth. But from a while we're talking about regulations and protecting our laborers and protecting our like one of the most interesting debates I remember seeing years ago was Ben Shapiro against Tucker Carlson of all people. And Ben Shapiro was taking a like fairly standard, exactly what you'd expect, a kind of Chicago school libertarian make the pie higher uh argument about international free trade being good. And Tucker Carlson was saying, no, I want to protect our labor. I want to protect our labor force. I want to, part of the reason to close the border is not just to stop the labor force, but the businesses as well, because there's business. So there is a sense, I think, to um, limiting outside competition from ousting your own people because that can be anti-competitive in the way we were talking about before. But there's a
Correct.
balance, and I think I'm not offended by the fact that we have Toyota, which is a foreign company, or Hyundai, phenomenal cars. My dad's put damn near 1 million miles on his Hyundai Elantra before he sold it. Um, but like there's a balance somewhere between those two. I would be interested in seeing what these Chinese cars are like. But I think it also makes sense to put, and maybe you could do this with tariffs, not like necessarily punitive tariffs. There's good I think that some of the commentators are right that there are good kinds of tariffs and bad kinds of tariffs. It's not like the Chicago people like all tariffs all bad all the time. It's like no.
It's actually one of the few places the Chicago School and I typically agree is on tariffs.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So,
Interesting.
um, it's a weird. Hey, you're gonna find something to agree with
Yeah,
everyone,
of course.
and tariffs are where I fall. And like, yeah, you got a good point there.
So,
But
in terms of protecting, as we were talking about before, with protecting workers, not just from getting their arms ripped off, but for caring about their lives and their welfare and their improvement as people and as citizens generally, and that being a concern that, if not overrides, then at least competes with the financial incentives that a company is inclined towards at the expense of the humanity. Wouldn't a nation also have a similar, wouldn't it be proper for a nation to have a kind of bias towards its own towards its own workers and towards its own companies, and not at the expense of competition, with outsiders because I think as we've have been talking about with competition generally, some amount of competition is not just inevitable, but healthy to have. But we also don't want to let competition by an outside force that is maybe being propped up in a monopolistic Uber-esque manner, which China might have an interest in doing if it has geopolitical interests in undermining the American economy. Um, we don't want to let that competition crush our workers. We want to allow that competition insofar as it helps our companies be better, right?
Well, they got to be better by competing. It's the age-old adage of saying when a new regulation is passed, for Toyota hires 50 new engineers and Ford hires 50 new lawyers, right? And your balance point you're talking about, I mean, like there's some low-hanging fruit. Let's just talk about that for a second.
Sure.
Because if you follow Milton Friedman and neoclassical economics or neoliberal economics to its conclusion, everything ends up under one company and is monopolistic control. And this
It's
is
very
where you
efficient.
or not, as the case might be.
They won and they have
Yeah.
no they won over who? There's no one
Well,
that you win over once they're all gone.
so like it's important to understand that Milton Friedman had his ideas. Then private equity, really, particularly the buyout firms, really got going. There's a book called Barbarians at the Gate over the takeover of Nabisco, which is worth a read. But basically, at the end of the day, we made the transition in the late 70s from stakeholder capitalism, where we're looking at how, what's the competition, what's the impact on the community, to shareholder supremacy, in which the sole function of these companies is to make as much profit for the shareholders at any expense.
So that I think is much closer to an idea that we might criticize that is than this word capitalism.
Well,
This
but
legal
it got packaged in
ruling.
capitalism. When people talk about late stage capitalism, this is what they're referring to.
But that comes from a particular ruling, right?
Debatable. Like so, you're talking about Ford v. Dodge,
Yeah, okay.
um, which is the ruling you're referring to, and for your audience sake, essentially Henry Ford wanted to reinvest
It was
into his employees, becoming the,
1919.
the 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 only game in town, right? Essentially, and he
Oh, that's a
wanted,
while
so
ago.
so that was how he wanted to do it. The Dodge brothers were on the board of directors. They were minority shareholders in the Ford Motor Company, and they
Mm,
wanted the dividends so they could then take those dividends and take Henry Ford's idea and create a competitor. And Henry
okay.
Ford told him to go kick rocks because he was a majority shareholder, and they sued him for minority shareholder rights. And
Okay.
the ruling that came out of that was that essentially, and it was like the point of their ruling was minority shareholders do have an interest. It's not just tyranny of the majority, so they have to be represented. Now, there's a whole conversation about how SpaceX is organized on this, but again, maybe for another debate.
Yeah.
Um,
Matthew Crawford also has some interesting criticisms of
don't even get me started.
Musk, where Tesla
We're
and
way too
self-driving
sober
cars is
for
concerned.
us to have that conversation.
Yeah.
But the point being here is that ruling implied that shareholders, the company should work in their shareholders, but that was not the application up until the late 70s.
So so you're saying capitalism is grouped in with this idea that we're hearing from Dodge versus Ford before.
What I'm
Um,
saying is that capitalism has what we think of as capitalism is what is from the Chicago School of, in particular, Milton Friedman.
okay, because this is not the same idea of competition that we were talking
No.
about before.
No,
So,
he would
yeah,
argue that monopolies were a good thing because they were hyper efficient, and that the
okay.
profit motive meant that these companies would be would inherently want to be able to do it. It's Milton Friedman's ideas with this same thought that led to NAFTA in the early 90s, where the economists were arguing that the winners of NAFTA would inherently, out of the goodness of their heart, want to support the losers of NAFTA, which is of course not what happened at all. But this is, and at the same time, you have people who were aficionados or acolytes of Milton Friedman, and Jack Walsh, former CEO of GE, was like Exhibit A for this. And he
Hmm.
he he really took Milton Friedman's ideas and drove it into the hyper financialization of everything. What is happening with GE today? It doesn't exist anymore. Why? Because he gutted it and sent it out in dividends and share buybacks.
So it
So your
sounds
low-hanging
like,
fruit.
because we're coming up on an hour here, if I can summarize and correct me if I'm wrong here, we've gotten to is we can think of capitalism as competition. We can think about it in an older sense as a system of government where the means of production, the capital is privately owned. We can think about it in terms of this sort of financialization and the legal enforcement of maximizing shareholder value. We can think about it in many different ways. But at the root of the complaints of all of these things, we have more precise terminology, whether that's the labor theory of value, whether it's Ford v. Dodge and the legal incentives, which to me is the most horrific. Um, and in each case, regulation is required to maintain the degree of freedom that we want because our desires themselves are at odds with like truly absolute freedom. We don't get absolutes. Um,
Well,
so
I would
like,
point to, on that term is that regulation is required for a capitalistic system to actually function correctly.
well,
And you can,
I would go back to the question of say for a capitalistic system, I assume here you are meaning capitalist as a competitive system, correct?
correct.
Okay, because
Let me preface it. It's a system in which the governmental or regulatory agencies are there to foster competition and lower the barriers to entry.
okay, because here's my problem still, and it's just one of terminology. Because it sounds like we're in agreement on almost everything here, but if we define capitalism as a competitive system, I could envision a Marxist economy, a communist economy that still has competition. I don't know how they do that, but there are ways you could do that. And I think as most people use the term capitalism, um, it that would be oxymoronic. It's not what people are talking about when they talk about capitalism.
No,
Capitalism
because
is a sort of system that is believed to lead to more competition. Whether it achieves that is very much in question and part of the thing we're talking about here. I would say it succeeds in some ways and very much fails in others, as you've illustrated. But I think what is the value of describing an economic system as capitalist over just saying it's competitive or not competitive?
well, I think the main distinction here, and this is a criticism, and knowing your audience, I imagine most people are going to start going, "This guy's an idiot." So I look forward to the YouTube comments on this next comment. But essentially, the people we're pointing to in the United States and going, "They're socialists," are not socialists. They're capitalists that want more regulation. And just stay with me here for a second. That the main distinction between capitalism and socialism is whether or not the means of production are in private ownership. And here's the example is like an oil company, right? There isn't any Bernie Sanders, AOC, Mandani, take your pick. None of them are calling for the nationalization of ConocoPhillips and ExxonMobil.
Right.
They want them more heavily regulated. That by itself eliminates them from being socialistic. Because a socialistic would say, no, that's a critical input to the economy, which means it should be collectively owned, the same way
Yeah.
that our roads are collectively owned.
I feel like socialism gets used as a slur much in the way that fascism gets used as a slur.
Correct.
It's like
Correct.
it's like
So
all
what
kinds of
we're
people who are not fascist get called fascist, and people who are like, I think we should have a better safety net. It's like socialist. Uh,
and that's exactly, I mean, Tucker Carlson made this argument that the capitalists have been the best arguments for socialism for decades, right? And in my case, universal healthcare is something that I'm very passionate about for a
mhm.
variety of reasons. I've lived in a universal healthcare environment. I've received care there, so has my wife. My brother lives in Canada and can speak very intelligently. He's lived in a number of different provinces.
And is
Um,
this universal healthcare system, whether it's done well or whether it's done poorly, is that a competitive market? Is that a competitive?
yes.
It
And
is.
that
Okay.
so the big distinction here is single payer health insurance removes the economic barriers, but all the means of production, so to speak, from the doctors and hospital, that's all privately owned and under these systems.
Mm.
From a competitive advantage standpoint, my biggest Achilles heel competitively in the labor market recruiting talent is I health insurance is too expensive. And people will say, well, that's because of government regulation, and we probably don't have enough time to go into it. But I mean, even the Koch brothers, even the Heritage Foundation, even the Cato Institute have all said, no, that's actually not true.
Well,
And so
now
when
we're
we
now
look
we're
at it like,
very far outside my domain of knowledge. But
yeah, so
yeah.
but think about it from a small business owner. If I didn't have to compete on benefits and I can just compete on pay and working conditions, I would have people lining up out my door. But I lose out on really good talent to bring to the little guy, to bring to small businesses, to bring to Main Street
Mhm.
America because of this system. So
Okay.
if you're going to be capitalistic, in my mind, and this I think Adam Smith would agree with me, is to say no, that's a barrier to entry, that's lowers competition, and therefore we should, this is the place where we should be stepping in.
So I I like your position a lot, although I still think I disagree with you that capitalism is a good synonym for competition. Just because in the conventional use of the term, it describes it's usually meant and interpreted as um, a theory of economic regulation or the lack thereof, basically, on the assumption that less regulation will lead to more competition. And I think you've given many illustrations now of how that is not actually how that works.
Well, that's
Um,
that's what Milton Friedman put out there, and I'm not making the argument that capitalism and competition are synonymous. What I'm saying is
okay.
that capitalism requires competition in order to like it's one piece of a greater pie, but
Okay.
it's a very critical piece of that pie. A capitalistic system, in my mind, would require us to make sure that we're avoiding the rent seeking, being competitive, right, and allocating capital
Sure.
and avoiding monopolies. Those are your four.
So, what
And
would be, in your view, and we'll maybe close the discussion here because I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know you're very busy with tax season as it is. Um, but what would your case be for the functionality of the term capitalism? What's added by that term?
I mean, at my very core, I'm a very axiomatic person. I do like my definitions because I don't think we can have a full conversation. I personally think right now that in our current political environment, terms capitalism, fascism, communism, those are all useless terms,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah,
I really truly believe that. I think the utility of the word capitalism is completely gone because people have twisted it to mean whatever the hell that they want to believe it to be.
right. But did it ever have utility?
I mean, as much as any other term.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one
I
of the
mean, you
most
use the term
useful words,
Platonic,
one of
right? So
I
what
like
what
Plato. I'm not a
utility?
Platonist. I
I
don't
understand,
think
but
Plato is a
we know
Platonist, though.
what you're talking about,
Mhm.
right? And
Right.
so like I think in our current environment, what we have is we have the I would actually argue that Milton Friedman's version of capitalism is basically neo-feudalism. And so he's using a capitalist word to disguise something that's completely fundamentally different from
Yeah.
capitalism.
Or at
And what
least
we've
that's where it
seen.
leads.
Correct. And what we've seen is people have said anything that isn't this form of capitalism that leads to a neo-feudal environment is socialism. And I just don't think that that's true.
Well, I think we have to be very careful in not conflating the ends of a theory or the consequences of a theory with the theory itself in name. Like the outcomes of Leninist Marxism are not the same thing as the doctrine of Leninist Marxism, although we can accumulate data points on where that goes. And the consequences of Milton Friedman's ideas are not the same thing as the ideas, and we're the word capitalism and the word socialism get us twisted on these 2 points very quickly. For many people, communism has become uh like identical with the Holodomor, just as like National Socialism has become identical with the Holocaust. Never mind that in many parts of the Middle East, and I'm not like advocating this, but in many parts of the Middle East, they basically run on National Socialist policies, but because of different ethnic dynamics there is no genocide. They're just running on semi-nationalized economies, um, and they're just doing their thing, and we don't care that much.
Well,
Um,
I think one of the things that made us stupider as a society was when we started to say, well, you can be capitalist or communist, and we forgot the other axis on that plane, which is libertarian and authoritarian.
mhm.
What we really talk about when we talk about the horrors of whatever, right? Pick, Nazi
Yeah,
Germany, Soviet Union, whatever, is really a result of authoritarianism more than it is economic organization. The other thing I'll say about that is, the term communism is something that I kind of chuckle at because people go, well, China's communist. And I would argue they are not
no,
communist. They are a
no, they're
state
not.
capitalist endeavor. They are
They're
unique in the world.
they're actually pretty
In
close to fascist in many ways, which
Well,
is
they're
which
getting
is kind
there.
of scary.
Yeah.
But it's also, yeah, it's kind of effective in many ways. I wouldn't want to live there, especially not during COVID. Like the what China was doing during COVID was pretty horrifying. And it's not great if you're a Uyghur Muslim either, or a Foxconn employee. Um,
No. But again, it's a model to look at and to
yeah,
say, as we've established, there are trade-offs to the
there are
American
trade-offs.
system. There are trade-offs to the Chinese system. There's a lot
Hmm.
of no, you're never going to escape that. This is like the one thing I cannot remember his name, but there's an economist who I very much disagree with, but that's the one thing that I agree with him on is there are trade-offs to everything and they're unavoidable.
Yeah, exactly. And as the stand-up economist said, the worst possible trade-off is the trade-off between one Snickers bar and an identical Snickers bar, because your
Yeah.
your cost benefit is always one.
Yeah.
There's no competitive advantage there. Anyways, thanks so much for chatting, Dylan. Hopefully, to the audience, this was illuminating on the question of the utility of the word capitalism, or maybe not illuminating, maybe just confusing. But food for thought, regardless. Um,
Well, and to your audience, I'd say if you got questions, comments, concerns, worries, put them in the comments, and maybe we'll come back and we'll go through and debate those questions and comments.
that'd be fun. Dylan, thanks so much.
Cheers.
Appreciate it, man.